A lot of people have been asking me what my favorite thing about Egypt was. And without a second thought, and at the cost of saying the most cliche thing possible, I say the pyramids. How could I not? It's not like I hadn't seen pictures of them before. In fact, during the trip, I discovered old emails and with them photographs Paripa had taken on his trip some 10 years ago. There were photos from inside the pyramids and other attractions around Egypt. But somewhere along the way, I'd completely forgotten what the inside of the pyramids actually looked like. And, well, before traveling, I wasn't about to look them up again. It's nice to be surprised like that. So when I stepped inside my first pyramid, my jaw genuinely dropped. Nothing could have prepared me for it. The narrow passages, the feeling of being inside something that has been there for 4,500 years. I was just staring. And this is all before I even talk about what it feels like standing outside one. Pictures really don't prepare you for the scale. You stand there looking up and suddenly feel very, very small. But let's take a step back. I've been meaning to travel to Egypt for quite a while. It was one of those places that felt like it had always existed in my imagination. Ever since I was a child and first heard about the pyramids and read about the mysteries and marvels around them. I remember hearing that the pyramids were visible from the moon. I remember reading that aliens had helped build them. Neither of that might be true, but when you're single-digit years old and hearing about the pyramids for the first time, it all feels possible. Even now, knowing what we know today, it's difficult not to be amazed. Archaeologists have uncovered records of workers, supplies, construction crews, and the immense bureaucracy that went into building them. Yet there is still something magical about them, and a tiny part of me, or perhaps the child in me, still wants to believe there was something otherworldly involved. Because my goodness, what those ancient Egyptians achieved is absolutely insane. These really are wonders of the world. For years, I'd kept putting the trip off. Every time I thought about going, I'd read articles about scams or difficult travel experiences and decide I'd do it another time. Then, 2 days before a week-long break, with absolutely no plans, I finally gave in to the itch. I landed in Cairo on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. Cairo feels like a city lost in time. There are parts of downtown that feel vaguely European, carrying the charm of another era. At other places, apartment blocks stretch endlessly into the horizon, all painted in variations of the same sandy brown color, blending almost seamlessly into the desert around them. I checked into my hotel, walked out into the balcony, and saw the Nile. What a sight it was. This river gave birth to one of the greatest civilizations in human history. It carried traders, armies, pilgrims, and pharaohs. It inspired myths, explorers, writers, and dreamers. It appears in the writings of ancient historians, fueled the imagination of Agatha Christie, and for thousands of years has been the thread connecting everything that happened along its banks. Even today, watching it flow through Cairo feels timeless. That evening, while driving towards the newer part of Cairo, I finally saw them. The pyramids. I'd spent the entire flight trying to spot them while descending into Cairo with no luck. Yet there they were, casually sitting in the distance behind the clutter of the city. And that was what struck me the most. Not their grandeur, but their normality. Imagine endless rows of apartment blocks, unfinished rooftops, you have to Google and read about this, satellite dishes in traffic, then peeking out from behind all of it, the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. I was completely taken. The next morning, we headed to Saqqara. Now, before this trip, if you'd asked me about Egyptian pyramids, I'd probably only have thought of Giza. But Saqqara ended up being one of the most fascinating places I saw. It's home to the step pyramid of Djoser, essentially the grandfather of every pyramid that came after it. What I loved about Saqqara is that it feels like you're watching Egypt figure itself out. You can almost see the leap from simple tombs to increasingly ambitious monuments. And that's where we really began learning about how obsessed the ancient Egyptians were with the afterlife. Obsessed, actually, is an understatement. The moment a pharaoh came to power, work often began on their tomb. Architects, artists, priests, and workers would spend decades preparing for a journey that wouldn't even begin until after death. The walls of the pyramids tell the story of a cosmic journey. The ceilings are painted like the night sky. Ra, the sun god, carrying the king aboard the solar bark. Horus leading the king into eternity. Entire funerary complexes were built around these beliefs. Bodies were mummified through elaborate rituals. Food, furniture, treasure, and offerings accompanied the deceased so that their ka, or life force, would have everything needed in the next world. Everything is designed around helping the king reach eternity. The whole thing is quite dramatic. Thousands of people devoting their lives to preparing one man's death. It's a story of magnificence, faith, power, and ego all at once. By the time I reached Giza and climbed into the chambers of the Great Pyramid, I was already quite overwhelmed. Standing before the pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure felt surreal. The oldest, tallest, and largest. Then there was the Sphinx, one of the most recognizable monuments on earth. Built during Khafre's reign, it combined the strength of a lion with the intelligence of a king. What fascinated me most was how its meaning evolved through time. Buried by desert sand for centuries, rediscovered, reinterpreted, and mythologized by generation after generation, it became something different to everyone who encountered it. 2 days later in Luxor, I would encounter its cousins, rows and rows of sheep-headed sphinxes lining the Karnak in Luxor temple. After such an intense first day, the second was slower. We spent hours inside the newly opened Grand Egyptian Museum, wandering through thousands of years of history covered in giant statues, colossal stone figures, and intricately carved artifacts. But the highlight was undoubtedly Tutankhamun. Seeing the objects recovered from his tomb all in one place is extraordinary. The nested coffins, jewelry, furniture, and finally the famous golden mask itself. These weren't just museum pieces anymore. They felt like fragments of an actual life from more than 3,000 years ago, somehow surviving all this time. And ever so often, through enormous glass walls, the pyramids would appear in the distance, quietly reminding me where all of this history came from. That evening, we explored Coptic Cairo, once part of the ancient city of Babylon in Egypt. The streets felt like they belonged to another time. Ancient churches, synagogues, stone walls, tucked between narrow alleyways. I bought myself a few trinkets and found old photographs showing Giza from decades ago, when there were no roads and locals posed atop their camels in endless desert. That night, we flew to Luxor. Now, originally, my plan had been very different. I thought I'd spend a couple of days in Cairo and then relax somewhere by the sea. Egyptians I knew recommended beach resorts on the Dead Sea or the Mediterranean, and I was almost convinced. Then I started reading about Luxor, and there was absolutely no chance I was skipping it. Who was I kidding? I was never going to spend a holiday sitting by a pool. So there it was. 2 hectic days in Cairo, followed by 2 hectic days in Luxor. Luxor is smaller, it's simpler and quieter. We found a beautiful hotel by the Nile, and for the first time all trip, I actually felt like slowing down. But well, the next morning we headed to the Valley of the Kings. These tombs are completely different from the pyramids. By this point in history, pharaohs had realized that giant pyramids were essentially advertisements for treasure. So instead of building upwards, they carved their tombs deep inside the limestone mountains. And what tombs they are! The walls just explode with color. You see gods, demons, celestial boats, giant serpents, and strange creatures drawn on the wall, guiding the pharaoh through the underworld and towards eternal life. The ceilings are painted with stars. The corridors stretch deep into the mountain. Every image has a purpose. It feels less like walking through a tomb and more like walking through an ancient illustrated guidebook to eternity. From there, we visited the temple of Hatshepsut, one of the most remarkable rulers in Egyptian history. At a time when female rulers were rare, Hatshepsut became pharaoh and ruled successfully for over 2 decades. To strengthen her legitimacy, she commissioned reliefs depicting her divine birth and connection to the gods. In many carvings, she even appears wearing the ceremonial beard traditionally reserved for kings. Her temple rises beautifully and dramatically from the cliffs behind it and is one of the most beautiful structures that I saw. The reliefs are extraordinary. Scenes of trade expeditions, religious ceremonies, and divine encounters line the walls. One image in particular stayed with me. Hatshepsut being nourished by the goddess Hathor in cow form, symbolizing divine legitimacy and protection. We also explored some of Luxor's other great temple complexes. Havu's temple, Luxor temple, and finally Karnak. You see battle scenes, processions, offerings, and victories covering the walls. Lotus flowers, cattle, bread, wine, incense, and treasure appear again and again. And I couldn't help noticing how familiar some of it felt. The lotus, the reverence for cows, the importance of the sun, the belief that earthly life is only one stage of a much larger spiritual journey. As an Indian, I found myself constantly drawing parallels because some of the symbols and ideas felt strangely familiar. Rows of sphinxes lined ceremonial avenues. Massive columns glowed in the evening light. Obelisks towered overhead. Everywhere we looked, there seemed to be another layer of history left behind by pharaohs determined to leave their mark. Many of Egypt's treasures now stand far from Egypt, taken abroad by conquering powers and collectors. Obelisks that once stood here now stand in cities across Europe. And yet, what remains is overwhelming. And then somehow, it was over. A few days earlier, Egypt had existed only in books, documentaries, and childhood imagination. Now it exists on a grainy old handcam. Shaky clips from Cairo taxis, sunlight bouncing off the Nile, dusty roads around Saqqara, painted ceilings hidden inside mountain tombs, the silhouette of pyramids appearing unexpectedly behind apartment blocks. For years, Egypt had felt almost mythical to me. And perhaps that's what surprised me the most. Not that reality failed to live up to the myth, but that somehow, impossibly, it exceeded it. We flew back to Cairo and left with hearts full of awe.